Daniel. Thanks to all the Jacarandas. We introduce tonight's special guest, Daniel Jose Older.
Some stories, when you finish them, make you want to run 5 laps around the block. Others make you throw the book or eat a ice, both for good and bad reasons. And then, every once in a while, you come across that rare and special story that when you land on that last word and put it down, all you can do is exhale and say, holy fucking shit. Nalo Hopkinson's Fisherman is one of those. It's an outstanding story, surrounded by other outstanding stories in her World Fantasy Award-winning collection, Skinfolk. Fisherman is a tale of slowly gathering tension, and in just a few pages we understand it is in fact the culminating moments of a life of slowly gathering tension. Hopkinson gracefully inundates us with the immensity of the ocean, the reek of freshly caught fish, the aching muscles after a long day's work, the swirl of camaraderie and doubt of being a quiet soul in a loud room. That is to say, all the basic elements of a good short story are there. Characters we care about, moving themes, sex, fear, conflict, resolution, ambiguity, and then there's something else too, that special humanity that Hopkinson imbues her literature with. It is a thing beyond the ability of all our lit crit and analytical skills to deconstruct. It is simply good-ass writing. Nalo Hopkinson has published 6 novels, and besides Skinfolk, she edited or co-edited 4 anthologies, including Whispers from the Cotton Tree Root, Caribbean Fabulous Fiction, and Mojo, Conjure Stories. Besides the World Fantasy Award, Hopkinson has won the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer, the Galactic Spectrum Award for Positive Exploration of Queer Issues in Speculative Fiction, the Sunburst Award for Canadian Literature, the Fantastic, and has been nominated for the Hugo, the Tiptree, and the Nebula Awards. Hopkinson didn't write her second novel, Midnight Robber, with a YA audience in mind, but it's still one of my favorite young adult books of all time. This book brings stark truth to the deeper story that the movie Avatar tried and failed at telling. A tale of rising above trauma through the complex, heartbreaking layers of intercultural, interplanetary solidarity and stepping into life. And beyond that, the same unrelenting, indescribable sense of humanity is wide awake and fully at play here. And it comes with the corollary that the world is not a cute little package left under a tree. The world is in fact on fire, Midnight Robber reminds us. It is fraught with dangers, betrayals, tragic mistakes, regrets. And we know this, all of us know this. So when we read these difficult truths in a book, that book becomes more than a great story. It becomes a friend, a reminder that we are not alone. As a writer, I am still just a baby. But when I was just a wee fetus of a writer, when I was still trying to make sense, as I still am, when I was trying to make sense of power, myth, sexuality, identity, Nalo Hopkinson was one of the voices that lit the way. So it is my great pleasure to introduce her to you here tonight, Nalo Hopkinson.
Sometimes you don't recognize yourself. Thank you, Dana, for that. Thank you. And to the 3 readers who preceded me, thank you very much for sharing your words. Hard acts to follow. I'm going to read from Sister Mine, my most recent novel. It came out in spring of this year, I believe. As the years go by and life gets fuller and fuller, I have a more and more difficult time remembering what happened when. But I think it was spring of this year. And I'll need somebody to sort of give me a high sign about when I'm at 15 minutes, because I don't have a watch on me. A lot of the story came out of a poem I talked about a little bit today, Goblin Market, a 19th century poem by Christina Rossetti about two sisters who are closer than skin in many ways. So in parts of the novel I quote from it. Like two pigeons in one nest, folded in each other's wings, they lay down, in their curtained bed like two blossoms on one stem. We had to be cut free of our mother's womb. She'd never been able to push the two-headed sport that was me and Abby out the usual way. Mom was still human at the time. My dad's family hadn't yet exiled her to the waters. After the C-section, just for a few days, she was kind of sidelined while she recovered. That gave Dad's family the opening they needed to move in and take over. Because from their perspective, things were a mess. Abby and I were fused, you see, conjoined twins. Abby's head, torso, and left arm protruded from my chest. We shared a liver and 3 3/4 legs between us. We had 2 stomachs, 2 hearts, and 4 lungs, and enough colon for us each to have a viable section, come to that. Abby and I could have lived as we were, conjoined. Between us, we had what we needed, but here's the real kicker. Abby had the magic, and I didn't. As far as the family was concerned, Abby was one of them, though cursed as I was with the tragic flaw of mortality. Abby and me, my mom brought us that gift. You might say that my dad married outside the family. To hear some of them tell it, outside the species. Most of his family would barely give Mom the time of day while she was still around, despite the fact that she and her kin had done steward service to them for centuries. Or rather, because of it. Dad's family could have stood it if she were just some dalliance of Dad's, a bit of booty call. Even love might have been okay if they'd kept it to a dull roar. Wouldn't have been the first time that a celestial had knocked boots with the help. But no, Dad and the help had to go and breed. With Mom unable to interfere for the time being, Dad's family decided that obviously the human doctors of the hospital where we were born had to surgically separate Abby and me. They put pressure on my dad till he agreed to it. They're not really venal, that lot, just too big for their britches. They've been emissaries of the big boss for so long that they forget that they aren't gods themselves, just glorified overseers. But overseers with serious power. Mom's kin didn't say boo. They knew damn well they didn't have enough cash to buy that much trouble. The second we were separated, Abby began to die. There was something vital she needed that my body had been supplying. No one could tell exactly what, but we were losing her. There's a guardian that attends births and deaths. He keeps his eye on the young and on the old, the former having so recently left the other world for this one, and the latter soon to depart that way again. That guardian, you might say, he's a border guard. It's his job to send the living on their way and the dead on theirs. If it's not your time, you're not going anywhere. He was there, ready to do his job, when Abby and I were born, the semi-celestial child and her human donkey of a sister. Now it was time for him to escort her back across the barrier between the quick and the dead. He lingered over our cribs in intensive care for an instant. He smiled at us both, chucked us under our tiny chins. He thought we were kind of cute. Then he kissed us each on the forehead and gently picked Abby up, cradled her in his arms. My dad, grieving, watched him. The guardian gave him a rueful look. Have I mentioned that the guardian is our uncle? Dad's brother? He took Abby, leaving my dad to weep at my bedside. The guardian should have carried Abby to the crossroads right away. Instead, he took her to my mom's room. He'd taken a shine to Mom Uncle had. A real shine. The kind that sets brother against brother, starts family feuds. Mom was still dopey from the anesthetic, but Uncle took care of that. Plain old unconsciousness was no challenge for the being who shuttled humans from life to death like beads on an abacus. Even in her half-sleep, she'd been begging to see her babies, and now she was fully awake. This was her first time seeing Abby, but when she clapped eyes on my uncle carrying a gasping bundle whose little mouth pursed like my dad's, she figured out pretty quickly that the baby was one of hers. The guardian's impartial, he has to be. Normally, he wouldn't be put in the position of herding family across the borders between life and death, since the rest of that lot don't die. Not permanently, anyway. Mom begged him for Abby's life. He replied, "There isn't enough of her to survive on this side of the gate. Mum was having none of it. She began to make promises. But what does a human have to offer a demigod? She tried to swear her lifelong obedience." Uncle shook his head. In a way, he already had that from every mortal on this plane and the next. But he didn't leave with Abby. Mum's arms ached to hold her baby. She promised sex, the best he had, and he's had some good stuff. He's not just Lord of the Grave, my uncle. All that born-in and dying business has given him a taste for some of the sweetest gifts of the flesh. My mum was fine, they tell me. All blackberry sweet juice. And she knew what to do with what she got. How do you think she managed to catch the eye of not just one celestial, but two? Thing is, Uncle, for all his lechery, is pretty professional about his job. He shook his head, turned towards the door, but Mom spied the tear twinkling in his eye, and she knew she'd underestimated him. Sure, he liked doing the nasty plenty well, but save her, Mom said wildly, and I'll love you. Uncle stopped. One hand on the door's crash bar, the other supporting Abby's 1 3/4 leg little rump. He knows lies, Uncle does. There's a propaganda machine that makes him out to be the prince of them, but that's some bullshit. Those are the same people that won't let their kids borrow fiction from the libraries. Stories aren't lies, people. Some of them are truer than any autobiography. But Uncle does know how lies taste. Refined sugar sweet, not molasses sweet like truth with its sulfurous backbite. Mum was telling the truth. The room was treacly with it. If he saved her daughter, she would love him. She would love death itself, fiercely and hotly. What parent wouldn't, under the circumstances? Uncle looked down at the child he was holding, at her piecemeal body and oddly canted face, her jaundiced skin going blue. She had my mom's eyes. We both do. Uncle turned. Mom reached her hand out, took his in it, her eyes brimming with hope, with love enough to fight for her child and more. Uncle whispered, "I can't do it. She needs organs, tissues that I can't give her. I'm a ferryman. I can't make her live." "All you need me for that," said my dad. He walked into Mom's room. Uncle tried to snatch his hand away from Mom's, but she held on and looked Dad full in the face. A mother's love is fierce with pride, and Mom was never one for regrets. Dad read the signs of what had gone on between them like spoor in the room. "You want this?" he asked Mom. "Yes." "Brother mine," said Dad, "give him a child." His 2 eyes made 4 with Uncle's. In that moment, Dad's eyes and his bark brown face were green, the bright green of new spring leaves. Gently, Uncle handed Abby over. Gently, Dad took her. His first time holding his baby. That was the moment that Uncle violated the border between this side and the next, for once he had taken a soul to himself. He wasn't ever supposed to hand it over until he had delivered it to its destination. If Uncle is a ferryman between the worlds, Dad is a gardener. His talents are growing, grafting, and pruning. "Let me go then now," he said. Dad said to his brother. "What?" said Mom. "Where are you taking her?" Dad replied, his voice full of loss. "Can't fix her up here. We have to go to the next side. You stay and see to Makeda." He tried on a smile. "We're going to bring her sister back to you before you could say Jack Mandora." Uncle embraced Dad. Their circled arms protected Abby. Mom had to look away from the brothers then. Their aspects were already changing, preparing to cross over to the other side. Mortals cannot look upon that celestial shift for long. It's like looking directly into the sun. Between the glory that was the brothers, dying Abby was a fleeting scrap of dull flesh. Then the 3 were gone. Mom clambered back into her bed, closed her eyes, and prayed for both her children. No point imploring the big boss. He has more important things to look after. As so many clay pickings do, Mom prayed to the celestials more directly involved in the affairs of this plane, in this case, to her lover and to his brother. So that's a story being told by the protagonist of the novel, Makeda, about her birth and her sisters, and sort of the story of herself as she's been telling it all her life. She's now, I think, in her mid-20s, and is trying to have a life of her own that's separate from her sister. But they do have relatives, and you've heard of one side of the family. And this next bit is a bit of an introduction to the other side. The baby wouldn't stop crying. Nothing Susie tried was working. Winston's diaper was dry. He was fed. He didn't have gas. There was nothing poking into him. He wasn't breathing. He didn't seem to be sick. And he certainly had all Susie's attention at the moment. But still he kept up a disconsolate sob, his little hands curled into angry, helpless fists. Naima stuck her head around the corner. She'd been happily playing some kind of 6-year-old game in the living room. "Mommy, the crows are cawing," she said. "That's wonderful, darling." Susie rocked the baby. The baby cried. "Mommy's kind of busy right now." "But what's wrong, Mommy? The crows are cawing and Weedle's crying." "Call him Winston, sweetie. That's his real name. You wouldn't like it if we made fun of your name, would you?" And Weedle cried. "The crows are unhappy, like Winston's unhappy," Naima responded. She stood and twiddled one of her plaits for a bit. When Susie didn't reply, she wandered back to the living room. Not a minute later, there was a huge crack, then a slushy, crashing sound from outside. Susie rushed out. On her way, she checked to make sure that Naima was still safely in the living room. She was. The crows had gone silent now. Susie realized she should have listened to Naima. Cawing crows. Around here, that meant something bad was coming. When the crows stopped cawing now, that meant something worse. It meant the bad thing had just happened and the crows had hightailed it out of there. Susie couldn't quite get out the door. The way was blocked by branches. The big old tree in the yard had cracked near its base and fallen over onto the house, which meant that something had gotten loose from the cage of the tree's roots, and Susie could guess what or who it was. When you were a steward to the Celestials, you saw a lot of family secrets. "Oh dear," Susie said to the baby, "this isn't good." Winston abruptly stopped whimpering. Instead, he stared, mesmerized, as a tendril of kudzu whipped around one of the branches closest to them, lengthening as it went. Susie's scalp crawled, fright winning out over flight. With the speed of a striking serpent, the kudzu reached for Susie's wrist. Susie shouted. She took a step backwards and slammed the sliding door shut. Her heart leapt in her throat like a live frog, desperate to escape. The kudzu vine pressed itself against the glass. Its frustrated leaves spread flat and hand-like against it. Susie managed to croak out, "Papa B, that you?" A rope of kudzu, nearly as big around as Susie's wrist, thumped against the glass. The door rattled in its track. Susie fought herself back from the brink of panic. She was a mama. She had these little ones to keep safe. She knew who could do for that kudzu for her. "Naima," she called, "get over here." Naima whined something back about wanting to stay and have tea with her dolls. Tiny curls of smoke began rising from the outer glass of the door where the kudzu was touching it. "Girl, don't give me your lip right now. Get over here, I said." Winston peacefully sucked his thumb and watched the rampaging kudzu. He pointed at it, looked up at Susie's face to see whether she noticed the fascinating new thing, too. "Yeah, baby, I see it. Don't worry. I won't let it hurt you." Winston wasn't the one who was worried. Naima came pouting around the corner. The clip had come off the end of one of her pigtails. The braid had begun to unravel, her springy hair blowing out into a puffball at the braid's tip. Her pink Dora the Explorer t-shirt had a smear on its chest that clearly showed the imprint of Naima's hand where she'd wiped it clean of heavens knew what. Little Bit was always getting her curious fingers into one thing or another. Susie paid mind to that after they got this bigger mess cleaned up. Naima was so small. Susie's heart ached for her eldest. She hefted Winston closer to her body and said to Naima, "Sweetie, you gotta call Mr. Cross, now." "But Mama..." "Hush, now," I said. "And I'll let you have a cookie after." Naima brightened up. "If I call him real quick, can I have 2 cookies?" A giant kudzu tentacle was curling up the glass. What if it got in the upstairs window? "Baby girl, if you can get him here lickety-split, I'll give you 1 for each finger on your hand." "Okay," replied Naima. "Fetch me a pillow, please, Mama, and the bones." She plopped down right there on the floor, suddenly all business. She was an uncanny child. Some part of her 6-year-old self understood that her job as living telephone was serious. She tucked her feet under her and rested an upturned palm on each knee, ready to receive the bones. Susie scurried to fetch them from the carved, lidded calabash on the side table in the living room. There was another thump from the direction of the sliding glass door. Susie yelled, "Old guy or not, don't you break that door. Do you want broken glass to hurt these children?" The kudzu left off its raging. Maybe there was enough of Daddy Wood left in there to remember to step careful around growing things when it wasn't their time yet. Please let it not be anyone's time in this house today. Her cell phone was on the table next to the calabash. She ached to call Roger, to hear his voice, but other humans couldn't help her and her children in this moment. One-handed because of the baby, Susie took the lid off the carved calabash and put it down on the side table. She fumbled around inside the calabash until she felt the smooth, warm bones. She snatched them up quick. Small aerial roots were growing, white and twisty as maggots from the kudzu limb. They were tugging at the tiny space between the sliding door and its jamb. As Susie pulled her hand out of the calabash, Winston playfully yanked on her hair. She jostled the calabash. It tilted, rolled. With an armful of Winston, she wasn't able to move quickly enough to stop the calabash from teetering, then falling over the edge of the table. She gave a little cry. The calabash hit the ground and shattered. The sound made Weedle jump and start to bawl. For a second, Susie just stared at the mesh of calabash shards on the floor. She wanted to cry too. "Mama, hurry!" called Naima. There was a gleam of white in among the beige and brown pieces of broken calabash. Susie opened her hand that was holding the bones and did a quick eye count. Mr. Cross had had Winston do her a favor by making her break the calabash, because in her haste, she'd gotten the 2 hand-carved bone dice, but not the all-important third one. Nearly sobbing, she muttered at Mr. Cross, "If you know you're wanted, why don't you just show up then?" Seemed like everything had to be a production around the old guys. The kudzu had taken to thumping over and over on the glass. No time to soothe Weedle. Susie bent and picked the thin, bleached bone from a black cat out from the calabash pieces. She dashed over and put the 2 dice in Naima's right hand and the cat bone in her left. Naima had already closed her eyes and begun the breathing that Susie taught her. Slow and careful, in through the nose, letting the breath fill and expand her tummy, then out through the mouth. Dandling a sobbing Weedle, Susie asked, "You doing your picturing?" Naima opened her eyes long enough to roll them at her mother. "Course." She closed her eyes again. Susie taught Naima to visualize the twin crossings her body made in that position. The lowercase T shape traced by her upper body and 2 arms, the X shape of her crossed legs, 2 roads crossing each other, twice for good measure. Crap, a pillow. Susie's boomerang-shaped nursing cushion was over on the couch where she'd last fed Winston. She snatched it up and went back to Naima. She bent carefully with the baby in her arms. Short goat, he loved being upside down. Susie fit the cushion around Naima's body, just in time, too. Naima's head snapped back and her eyes rolled up. She began to shake and foam at the mouth. Winston shook his head from side to side and tried to imitate the garbled sounds that Naima was making. Susie hated this part. Her little bit, her baby girl. She bent to cradle Naima's head as best she could, the way it was bouncing around like that. Her eyes on Naima, Susie yelled to the kudzu, "Your brother's coming! You just talk to him instead of damaging any more of my property!" Naima stopped convulsing. She sat up and wiped the foam from her mouth with the back of her hand. Her eyes were still showing only their whites. She said, "You rang," in her best mock deep lurch voice. Then she giggled. The racket outside had quieted. Weedle made a surprised noise. Susie looked to where he was pointing, at the door. The kudzu was clean gone, as though it had never been. Am I at time? Nobody's saying anything.
We want more.
We're fine.
All right, I won't get through all of this. There's a few more pages where I can at least show you who shows up after Naima does her call. An actual silk cotton tree would have been able to survive the Toronto climate. When Susie's neighbors looked at the huge tree in her yard, they saw an ash tree, or sometimes a graceful spruce with needles that gleamed golden from certain angles. The tree was both of those things, as well as a silk cotton tree. From what the neighbors had told her, Susie had deduced that its ash tree presence, she'd heard one of the old guys call it Yggdrasil, dutifully shed its leaves in fall and sprouted tiny buds in early spring. Peak ash, its golden spruce form, was resplendent in its coat of gleaming needles and produced pine cones for those who saw it as a spruce. For Susie and her family, the tree was covered crown to base in small thorns, shed its leaves in the dry season, and then sprang big scarlet flowers that gave way to fluff that blew everywhere. The kudzu that used to cover it had never seemed to spread. If it had, old Daddy B would have lost his shit. He was fussy about letting invading species loose in vulnerable ecosystems. Now, if you were the type to see the tree as an ash or a spruce, you didn't get fluff or kudzu. Mr. Cross jokingly called his tree the castle of the devil. He seemed endlessly amused at being constantly misidentified as said devil. Today, whatever else it had been, the silk cotton tree lay heavily on the ground, as down as a giant felled by a brash young boy with a slingshot. Squandered this time, said Susie. Sure it is, said Mr. Cross. He's fucking snuffed it. The ancient being's grin seemed perfunctory. He looked worried. His words came out in young Naima's voice, issued forth from Naima's small body. Naima's eyes were still rolled back, though she could apparently see where she was going just fine, and the way she carried herself was different, more studied, and somehow older than the carriage of a 6-year-old girl. She'd walked out there with measured steps, clutching the bones firmly in her 2 hands to maintain the connection between her and Mr. Cross. Susie sighed. Such a big job for a little one, to be Mr. Cross's ridden in this generation of their family, but the duty chose who it would choose. Centuries her family had been in charge of the hoodoo tree. It was their old guy's branch of the eternal tree, the spine of the world's soul. She'd heard tell that accidents had happened to parts of the world tree before. So long as the world still existed, the tree always mended itself eventually. Susie shone the flashlight down into the hollowed-out place where the tree's roots had been, now ringed around with jagged teeth of rotten wood. Something shifted away from the beam of light. There's something down there, she told Mr. Cross. He raised an eyebrow, a gesture too elegant for her little girl. Underneath all the preciousness, his movements were careful, his face too still. That's how he got when he was pissed and biding his time. That worried Susie even more than the lightning-blasted hoodoo tree. Was he mad at her for letting this happen? Mr. Cross got down on his knees and peered inside the hole. He said, something there. So there is. Talking down into the hole like that made his voice echo, only it sounded like 2 people saying the same words. Naima and a deep-voiced man. Not the one I'd hoped to see, though. That pigeon has flown the coop. Mr. Cross looked up at Susie. Stop fretting, sis-in-law. I know you weren't careless. Susie felt her shoulders lower in relief. She'd heard that Mr. Cross could carry his soul halfway across the border between life and death and strand it there for as long as he chose. Mr. Cross sighed. Someone took entirely too much care over this escapade. He reached a hand down into the hole. Come out, little earthworms, he cooed. His voice was shaking with suppressed anger. You know I won't hurt you. From the hole, a woman's voice replied, We know that, sir, but it was finally just getting quiet in here again after all that commotion that one was making last night. We were trying to enjoy the peacefulness. Susie knew that voice. Hearing it brought on a fever shock like someone had doused her in warm water. Ma, she said, is that you? Susanna, how are you hearing me? You never have before this. Not since I crossed over. Mr. Cross said, come on up, Pearl, if you want to chat with her for a bit. She can see and hear you while I'm here. He said to Susie, some of your kinfolk choose to hang around for a little while after they've passed over. Susie had known in theory that the ghosts of her family's dead gathered around the exposed buttress roots of the silk cotton tree, but she half decided that was just a story the adults told to frighten children away from the tree. Heaven knew she told Naima the same story herself. Ma was here all this time and you never told me? He shrugged. Not my business. You're already living and she's already dead. The old guys could be so cruel without scarcely knowing they were doing it. Susie found she was shaking. She wasn't sure whether it was with anger for opportunities long past and long lost, or with longing trepidation for what was about to happen. What would Ma look like? By the time she died, the illness had burned all the plumpness from her body. A man's voice from the hole, trembling with age and speaking with an accent Susie didn't recognize and could barely understand, said, Tell her that baby of hers is coming down with a cold. A cold. Figures, Susie said to Winston, chucking him under his chin. You have to go and do everything your big sister does, don't you? Naima was just getting over a cold. Then Susie remembered her manners. She called down, Thank you, sir, into the hole. Her voice echoed with only one person's voice. The ghost down below continued, You should give him catnip tea and grease him all over with camphor and lard. Susie blinked in surprise. The hell? For heaven's sake, Peter, said Ma. You're confusing curing a child with pickling it. Thank you.